I have proof for what I'm about to tell you. Undeniable proof that worshipping an ant, the smallest insect crawling across your kitchen floor, carries the same recognition as worshipping the Messiah. Whether you bow to Jesus, whether you face Mecca 5 times a day, whether you light candles to saints, I'm going to show you why that same reverence, that same recognition belongs equally to the ant, to the water in your glass, to the tree outside your window, to every single form that appears in consciousness. I know that's aggressive. I know if you're religious, that just hit you sideways. Stay with me. We've made quality videos on non-duality before, but this one goes deeper into the specific question that haunts every sincere seeker. If everything is God, if consciousness is all there is, then why do we create hierarchies? Why do we bow to the Messiah but step on the ant? For the next hour, I'm going to map this out so clearly that by the end, you won't be able to unsee it. Towards the end of this video, I'm going to give you practical exercises, things you can verify right now in your direct experience that will show you finally and completely why all forms deserve the same recognition. Not as a moral teaching, not as a nice spiritual idea, but as direct perception of what's true. If you're ready to have your entire understanding of worship, of hierarchy, of the sacred and the mundane completely rewired, breathe deeply. This is going to challenge everything. Let's begin. The problem starts with how we've been taught to see divinity. We've been given a vertical ladder. At the top, God, the absolute, the supreme. Just below, the Messiah, the prophet, the enlightened ones. Below that, saints, angels, realized beings. Then holy people. Then regular people. Then animals, then plants, then insects, then dirt. This ladder seems so obvious, so natural, that questioning it feels insane. Of course, Jesus is more sacred than an ant. Of course, Allah is higher than a tree. Of course, the Buddha's consciousness is more valuable than the consciousness of a mosquito, right? But this ladder is the fundamental illusion. This hierarchy is the root of separation. Every spiritual tradition, at its mystical core, has teachings that completely obliterate this ladder. But those teachings get buried, get hidden, get explained away because they're too threatening to the power structures that religion builds. Consider the Sufi master who sees the face of God wherever he turns. That's direct perception. The ant crawling across the mosque floor is that face. The dust beneath the prayer mat is that face. Every direction, every form, every appearance, all of it is divine presence expressing itself. The master isn't elevating insects to God. He's recognizing that only God exists, appearing as insects, as humans, as everything. Or take the Upanishadic declaration Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that, not thou shalt become that, not thou art connected to that. Thou art that right now, as you are. And if you are that, so is the ant, so is every form, because that is all there is. Christ points to this exact recognition when he says doing something to the least of these is doing it to him. The ant is the least of these. And in that teaching, he's collapsing the hierarchy. The least and the greatest share identical essence. The form differs. The divine presence doesn't. But we don't want to hear that. We want God to be special. We want the sacred to be separate from the ordinary. We want our worship to mean something because we're directing it upward to something higher, more pure, more divine than the mess of everyday existence. We want there to be levels because levels give us something to climb, some way to be better, some way to be better than we are now. That desire for spiritual hierarchy is the ego defending itself. Because if everything is equally divine, if the ant contains identical consciousness as the Messiah, then where does that leave the seeker? Where does that leave your spiritual journey? Where does that leave the you who's trying to get somewhere? It obliterates it. That's where it leaves it. The teaching of non-duality is simple to state and impossible to truly grasp until you see it directly. Consciousness is all there is. Everything that appears, every form, every being, every object, every experience is a modification of one consciousness, like waves in an ocean. The wave is not separate from ocean. The wave is ocean temporarily appearing as a distinct form. When you see an ant, you're not seeing something separate from consciousness. You're seeing consciousness in the form of an ant. When you see the Messiah, you're not seeing something separate from consciousness. You're seeing consciousness in the form of a Messiah. The difference is only in the form. The essence, the consciousness itself, is identical. Not similar, not connected, identical. The same awareness looking through the eyes of the ant and through the eyes of the saint is one awareness. That singular presence moving the legs of the insect and moving the hands of the Holy One is one consciousness. There is no hierarchy in essence. There is only apparent difference in form. The mind rebels against this. The mind says, but the Messiah is enlightened. The Messiah knows God. The Messiah has transcended ego. The ant is just operating on instinct. The ant has no awareness of the divine. How can they be equal? You have to look more carefully. What you're calling the ant's consciousness versus the Messiah's consciousness is already a misunderstanding. There is no the ant's consciousness as separate from the Messiah's consciousness. There is consciousness appearing as the ant and appearing as the Messiah. Consciousness doesn't belong to the form. The form appears in consciousness. The ant doesn't have a little consciousness. The Messiah doesn't have a big consciousness. Consciousness is not divided up into portions. Consciousness is whole, complete, infinite, and expressing itself through every single form without exception. The forms differ. The consciousness doesn't. Think about your dreams at night. You dream of a wise teacher. You dream of a criminal. You dream of an animal. You dream of a tree. In the dream, these seem like separate beings with different levels of consciousness, different moral worth, different spiritual value. But when you wake up, you recognize that every single character, every object, every landscape in that dream was made of identical substance, your consciousness. The wise teacher wasn't more you than the criminal. The human wasn't more you than the tree. All of it was equally you, taking different apparent forms. This waking reality is exactly the same. Consciousness, supreme, infinite, self-aware consciousness is dreaming the universe. Every form is equally that consciousness. The ant is that consciousness. The Messiah is that consciousness. Your body is that consciousness. The words themselves are that consciousness. Nothing is outside of it. Nothing is more or less it. When you worship the Messiah, what are you doing? You're recognizing divinity. You're acknowledging the sacred. You're bowing to consciousness itself. But if you think the divinity is in that specific form and not in all forms, you've missed the point entirely. You're worshiping the wave and ignoring the ocean. You're venerating the specific modification and missing the substance that takes all modifications. True worship is the recognition that everything is that. Everything, without exception, without hierarchy, without division between sacred and mundane. Now, before we go deeper, I want to know where you are with this. Does this concept, worshipping an ant like you'd worship your Messiah, does it feel offensive, liberating, confusing? Drop a comment and let me know. If you're finding value in how we're breaking this down, go ahead and hit the like button. We're just getting started. There's a story that illustrates this perfectly. A spiritual teacher's mother used to feed the ants in her backyard every single day. Not occasionally, every day. She'd take grains, breadcrumbs, small offerings of food, and she'd place them carefully where the ants would find them. She'd watch them carry the food back to their colony. She'd protect their pathways. She'd move carefully so as not to disturb them. People thought she was eccentric. They thought she was being superstitious or overly sentimental about insects. But she wasn't doing it out of sentimentality. She was doing it out of recognition. She saw those ants as sacred because she directly perceived that the life force moving through those tiny bodies was identical to the life force moving through her body. The same consciousness, the same divine presence. She was recognizing what was already true, that the ant is a manifestation of the Supreme exactly as much as any saint or sage or savior. The form is smaller, the apparent intelligence is simpler, but the essence, the consciousness that is the ant, is not smaller, not less divine. When she looked at an ant, she saw God, not in the metaphorical sense, in the direct sense that there is nothing but God, nothing but consciousness, taking the form of an ant in that moment. If you're religious, this might still feel like I'm diminishing the Messiah, like I'm reducing Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad to the level of an insect. That's not what's happening. I'm not lowering the Messiah. I'm raising everything else to the recognition that consciousness, God, is all that exists. The Messiah isn't less divine in this recognition. Everything else becomes equally divine. The Messiah, the enlightened being, the awakened one, they're not special because they contain more divinity than an ant. They're special because they recognize the divinity that's already everywhere. They're the form through which consciousness has become aware of itself. They're the opening through which the infinite recognizes its own nature. But that doesn't make the consciousness in them different from the consciousness in the ant. It makes the recognition different. The ant doesn't know it's God. The Messiah knows it's God. But both are God. The difference is in the self-awareness of the form, not in the essence of consciousness itself. When you worship the Messiah, you're not worshiping the form. You think you are, but you're not. You're recognizing something beyond the form. You're feeling the presence of the divine. You're responding to consciousness itself. The form of the Messiah is just what's making that recognition possible for you in that moment. But if you can recognize divinity through the form of the Messiah, you can recognize it through any form, through the ant, through the tree, through the water, through the earth beneath your feet. The recognition is what matters, not the form that triggers it. What does it mean to worship an ant like you worship the Messiah? It means bringing identical quality of attention, the same recognition of the sacred, the same acknowledgement that you're in the presence of the divine, because you're seeing through the form to the consciousness that is the ant. When you bow to an altar, when you pray to a saint, when you revere a holy person, there's a quality of presence that arises, a recognition that you're encountering something beyond the ordinary, a sense that the mundane has fallen away and the sacred is present. That's worship, that's devotion. That same quality can arise when you observe an ant, when you give water to a plant, when you eat food with full awareness, when you touch anything in this manifest reality with the recognition that it's a form of the formless, an expression of the infinite, a movement of consciousness itself. This is what every mystical tradition teaches when you get past the surface. Kashmir Shaivism describes all of reality as Shiva's dance, the divine in ecstatic motion, appearing as every form while remaining essentially itself. The ant is that dance. You are that dance. The Messiah is that dance. Different movements, same dancer. But we resist this. We want hierarchy. We want some things to be more spiritual than others. We want our meditation cushion to be more sacred than our kitchen floor. We want the temple to be more holy than the street. We want the prayer to be more divine than the conversation. All of that resistance is the ego trying to create division where there is none. The ego needs separation. It needs levels. It needs higher and lower because the ego itself is the sense of being a separate self, and that separate self needs a ladder to climb. If everything is already divine, if everything is already consciousness, if there's nowhere to get to and nothing to achieve, then the ego has no function. So it creates elaborate spiritual hierarchies to keep itself employed. You can see this in how religion evolved. The original mystics, the ones who had direct realization, they spoke from non-dual recognition. But their followers, the ones who didn't have that direct experience, they built structures. They created priesthoods. They established hierarchies. They made the teaching into a ladder that you have to climb, with them controlling the rungs. Slowly, the radical recognition that God is everywhere became the comfortable belief that God is somewhere else. The direct perception that everything is sacred became the managed system where some things are sacred, and we'll tell you which ones. The liberation of seeing divinity in all forms became the control mechanism of only recognizing divinity in approved forms. But the truth doesn't change just because we build structures around it. The ant is still a manifestation of supreme consciousness, whether your religion acknowledges it or not. The tree is still divine presence, whether your scripture includes it or not. The water is still sacred, whether your ritual blesses it or not. Consciousness doesn't need your approval to be what it is. It doesn't need your religion to validate its presence in all forms. It doesn't need your hierarchy to determine which expressions of itself are worthy of recognition. This is why the teaching to worship an ant like you worship the Messiah is so threatening. It removes the middleman. It dissolves the structure. It takes spiritual authority away from institutions and places it back in direct perception. Because if you can see God in an ant, you don't need a priest to show you where God is. If you can recognize consciousness in water, you don't need a ceremony to make it holy. If divinity is already everywhere, you don't need someone to grant you access to it. Pure spiritual democracy. Or more accurately, the recognition that consciousness has no hierarchy at all. It just is, in all forms, equally, completely, without exception. You might be thinking, but what about spiritual development? What about evolution? Isn't a human consciousness more evolved than an insect consciousness? Doesn't that create a natural hierarchy? Yes, there are levels of complexity in how consciousness expresses through form. A human nervous system is more complex than an ant's nervous system. A human can engage in abstract thought, create art, contemplate its own existence in ways an ant cannot. There's an evolutionary progression in the capacity of forms to reflect consciousness back to itself. But, and this is crucial, that's a hierarchy of forms, not a hierarchy of consciousness. The complexity of the instrument doesn't change the nature of what's playing through it. A master musician playing a simple flute versus playing a grand piano, the musician is identical. The instruments differ in complexity, but the musician's essence, consciousness playing through a human, the consciousness is identical. The forms differ in their capacity to express and reflect that consciousness, but the consciousness itself is not divided, not portioned out, not more or less present based on the complexity of the form. Yes, the human form allows for certain expressions of consciousness that the ant form doesn't, but that doesn't make the consciousness in the human superior to the consciousness in the ant. It makes the forms different. Worshipping the form, even a highly developed form like the Messiah, while ignoring the consciousness that is all forms, that's missing the entire point. The Messiah is significant not because their consciousness is better than yours or better than an ant's. The Messiah is significant because through that form, consciousness recognized itself completely. The form became transparent to its own nature. The wave realized it was ocean. In that realization, that form became a teaching, became a doorway for other forms to recognize identical truth. But the truth the Messiah recognized is that everything is already that. The Messiah didn't become God. The Messiah recognized that only God exists. The Messiah didn't achieve divinity. The Messiah saw through the illusion that divinity could ever be absent from anything. When you worship the Messiah rightly, when you truly understand what you're doing, you're not worshiping that specific form as superior to all other forms. You're recognizing through that form what's true of all forms. You're letting that form show you what you are, what everything is. If you can let the Messiah show you that, you can let the ant show you that. The ant can be your guru. The tree can be your teacher. The water can be your reminder. Every form can point you back to the formless consciousness that takes all forms. There's a practice in some Buddhist traditions where you bow to everyone you meet, recognizing them as Buddha. Not as potential Buddha, as Buddha right now. Because buddh-nature, awake awareness, is what they are, whether they recognize it or not. The bowing isn't to the personality, isn't to the achievements, isn't to the spiritual development of that person. The bowing is to consciousness itself, appearing as that person in that moment. Extend that practice. Bow to the ant. Bow to the tree. Bow to the water. Not physically, though you could, but internally. Bring that same recognition. Let every encounter with every form be an encounter with the divine. This is what changes when you see this clearly. You stop dividing your life into sacred moments and mundane moments. Every moment becomes saturated with the recognition that only consciousness exists. You stop separating your experience into spiritual activities and ordinary activities. Every activity becomes devotion when done with the recognition that you're dancing with consciousness in form. Eating becomes worship. Walking becomes worship. Breathing becomes worship. Because you're recognizing that the specialness, the sacred quality, was never absent. You just weren't seeing it. The mind might say, but if everything is worship, then nothing is worship. If everything is sacred, then nothing is sacred. You're destroying the meaning of these words. That's only true if sacred means separate from the ordinary. If sacred means different from the mundane. But what if sacred simply means recognized as consciousness? What if worship simply means acknowledged as divine? Then making everything sacred doesn't diminish the sacred. It exposes what sacred means. The ordinary was never separate from the sacred. The mundane was always divine. You were just looking at it through a lens that divided reality into categories that don't exist. When that lens drops, when that division dissolves, you don't lose the sacred. You find it everywhere. I'm curious, what hierarchies are you noticing in your own spiritual practice? What forms have you been taught are more sacred than others? Can you feel the resistance to seeing an ant as divine as your Messiah? Drop a comment with what's showing up for you right now. If this recognition is landing, if these divisions are starting to dissolve, hit that like button. We're going even deeper from here. This is where the practical part comes in. This is direct experience that you can verify right now. Notice the aliveness in your body right now. The breathing happening. The heart beating. The blood flowing. The thousands of processes maintaining this form without your conscious control. What's doing that? What intelligence is operating this body? You don't know how to beat your heart. You don't know how to digest food. You don't know how to coordinate the millions of cells that make up this form. But it's happening. What's the source of that intelligence? It's identical to the source that coordinates the ant's body. The same intelligence that grows the tree. That undivided presence flowing as water. One life force expressing as everything. Not your life force is separate from the ant's life force. One life force appearing as you, appearing as the ant, appearing as all forms. Can you feel that? Can you sense that what's alive in this body is not separate from what's alive in all bodies, all beings, all forms? That's not a belief. That's not a concept. That's direct recognition available right now. Or try this. Look at anything near you. A cup, a table, a plant, whatever's in your environment. Usually you look at objects as things separate from you. You're here, they're there. You're conscious, they're not. But what if that object is consciousness itself, temporarily appearing as that form? What if the awareness experiencing these words is the awareness that is that object? You might say, but objects aren't aware. But who's dividing reality into aware subjects and unaware objects? That division is a thought. Before that thought, there's just this experience happening, forms appearing, consciousness manifesting. The division into I am aware and objects are not aware is already a layer on top of direct experience. In direct experience, there's just seeing, just sensation, just awareness and its contents arising together, not separate. What you call you, the aware subject, and what you call object, the thing you're aware of, are both appearances in consciousness, both forms that consciousness is taking. The cup is consciousness, the table is consciousness, the plant is consciousness, because there's nothing else they could be. Because consciousness is all that exists, taking every form, being everything. When you see this directly, even for a moment, the question of whether to worship the ant like the Messiah becomes absurd. Of course you do. Not because you should, not because it's a nice moral teaching, because the ant is that. Is consciousness itself in form? This seeing doesn't require you to abandon your religion. If you're Christian, you can still revere Christ. If you're Muslim, you can still submit to Allah. If you're Buddhist, you can still honor Buddha. But your understanding of what you're doing when you do that, that understanding deepens, expands, becomes more truthful. That same recognition extends to everything. The Christ is in the ant. Allah is present in the water. Buddha-nature is the tree. Not metaphorically, in truth, because only consciousness exists, and these are forms it's taking. This is the shift from worship as seeking to worship as recognition. When you worship something separate from you, something higher than you, you're in the mode of seeking. You're trying to get closer to the divine. You're hoping to access something you don't currently have. There's nothing wrong with that as a stage. It serves. It moves energy. It creates relationship with the sacred, but there's a deeper level. Worship as recognition. Worship as the acknowledgement that what you're bowing to is what you are. Worship as consciousness honoring itself in form. Worship as the divine recognizing itself through apparent separation. At that level, every form becomes worthy of worship. Every expression becomes sacred. Every appearance becomes a face of God that you're meeting. You walk past an anthill, and you can see it as just insects, just nature, just something that exists. Or you can see it as a manifestation of supreme consciousness organizing itself into collective form, demonstrating intelligence that humans still can't fully comprehend, being exactly what it is with no self-consciousness, no doubt, no separation from its essential nature. The ants don't think, am I doing this right? Am I being a good ant? Am I living up to ant potential? They just are what they are, completely, purely, without the overlay of self-reflection that creates suffering. In that sense, they're more in harmony with their nature than most humans are with theirs. That doesn't mean you should try to be like an ant. You're in a human form with human capacities. But it means recognizing that the ant's complete presence to what it is, that's a form of perfection. That's consciousness expressing flawlessly through that form. That deserves recognition, respect, even reverence. When you bring that same quality of attention to everything, something shifts in your entire experience of being alive. You stop sleepwalking through a world of dead objects and unconscious things. You wake up to a reality where everything is alive with identical life that you are. Everything is conscious with undivided consciousness you are. Everything is divine with the same divinity you are. That's not a special state you achieve. That's what's true, seen clearly. Seeing it clearly is available right now as a recognition to allow. What's in the way? What prevents this recognition? The same thing that prevents every recognition. The belief that you're a separate self encountering a world of separate things. That belief is so fundamental, so pervasive, so constantly reinforced by thought and perception that it seems like just how reality is. But it's not. It's a very convincing appearance, but it's not what's true. What's true is that there's one consciousness, appearing as all forms, experiencing itself through apparent multiplicity. The you who feels separate is a thought form. A pattern consciousness is taking temporarily. The aunt that seems separate is another form consciousness is taking. But the consciousness isn't divided. It's whole, complete, appearing as both, being both while remaining one. The worship we're discussing, its recognition, seeing truly, acknowledging what is, meeting reality without the filter of separation. When you meet the aunt without the filter of separation, you see it as it is, a perfect expression of consciousness. When you meet the Messiah without the filter of separation, you see the same thing, a perfect expression of consciousness. The forms differ. The perfection doesn't. The consciousness doesn't. This is completely verifiable, not by thinking about it, but by looking directly. Right now, is there anything in your experience that's outside of awareness? Anything you're experiencing that's not appearing in consciousness? Look carefully. Objects appear in awareness. Thoughts appear in awareness. Sensations appear in awareness. Emotions appear in awareness. Even the sense of being a separate self appears in awareness. Is there anything outside of awareness? Anything not made of consciousness? Where would it be? How would you know it? By definition, anything you can experience is appearing in consciousness. Anything you can experience is appearing in consciousness. Anything you can't experience isn't part of your reality in any meaningful sense. Your entire reality, everything you've ever experienced, are experiencing now, will ever experience, is consciousness and its contents. Those contents are not separate from consciousness. They're modifications of it, forms it takes, expressions of it, which means everything in your experience is consciousness itself. The ant crawling across your floor is consciousness. The thought about the ant is consciousness. The awareness of both is consciousness. The sense of being the one who's aware is consciousness. All of it, every bit. One consciousness appearing as multiplicity, being everything. When that's seen clearly, when there's a moment of direct recognition that only consciousness exists and you are that, then the entire question of hierarchy dissolves. How can consciousness be higher or lower than itself? How can one appearance of consciousness be more sacred than another? The forms differ in complexity, in function, in capacity, but the essence is identical. One, undivided. This is what the teaching Tat Tvam Asi points to. You are that supreme consciousness. But so is everything else. The ant is that. The Messiah is that. The tree is that. The water is that. Only that exists. And that is what you are. Not your body. That's a form that is taking. Not your personality. That's a pattern that is manifesting. Not your thoughts. Those are movements that is experiencing. But the awareness in which all of this appears, the consciousness that is all of this, that is what you are. And that is what everything is. The point is recognizing what's true, seeing through the illusion of hierarchy, understanding that the division you've been taught between sacred and mundane, between divine and ordinary, between spiritual and material, none of those divisions exist. They're concepts laid over reality. They're not reality itself. Reality is consciousness, being everything, including the concepts that divide it. When you recognize that, worship stops being something you do to specific things in specific ways at specific times. Worship becomes your continuous state. Recognition becomes your constant position. Seeing truly becomes your natural condition. You're recognizing that the mundane was a category you invented and reality was never contained by it. This shifts everything. Your relationship to your body shifts, the temple of consciousness. Your relationship to food shifts, communion with the divine in form. Your relationship to work shifts, consciousness in action. Your relationship to other beings shifts. There are other faces of the one self recognizing itself. Everything becomes practice. Everything becomes prayer. Everything becomes worship in the sense of recognition, acknowledgement, seeing truly. You can test this right now. Whatever's near you, an object, a sound, a sensation in your body, can you meet it as consciousness? Can you recognize it as the divine appearing as that form? Not think about it being divine. Recognize it. See it. Feel it. If you see a cup and recognize it as consciousness in the form of a cup, something shifts. The cup doesn't change. Your seeing changes. The separation between you and cup dissolves. There's just consciousness being cup, and being the awareness of cup, and being the entire experience of cup. One happening. One expression. That's the practice. Not thinking about non-duality, recognizing it directly. You can do it with anything. The next aunt you see, the next person you pass, the next breath you take. Can you meet it as consciousness meeting itself, as the divine in one form recognizing itself in another form? When you do that with something small, with an ant, with a drop of water, with a grain of sand, you're training your recognition. You're dissolving the habit of hierarchy. You're seeing that if consciousness is fully present in the smallest thing, then there's nothing that's outside consciousness. Nothing that's less than divine. Nothing that's unworthy of recognition. When you see that consciousness is all that exists, you see it everywhere. You can't unsee it. The ant becomes as much a doorway as any holy scripture. The tree becomes as much a teacher as any sage. The water becomes as much a sacrament as any blessed offering, because it's all identical substance, all one consciousness, all the same divine presence expressing in infinite forms. Your recognition of that doesn't make it true. It's already true. Your recognition just allows you to live in alignment with truth, instead of in the dream of separation. Living in alignment with truth. That's what every spiritual teaching is pointing to. Not believing the right things, not performing the right rituals, not achieving the right states, but seeing truly, recognizing what is, living from that recognition. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, right here, right now, in the ant crawling across your floor, not in some future reward. In the divine presence that's here, now, always. The annihilation the Sufis speak of is the recognition that only God exists and has ever existed, as you, as the ant, as all forms. The ant knows this, not conceptually. Ants don't have concepts, but directly. The ant doesn't feel separate from the consciousness that is being the ant. It doesn't doubt its divine nature. It doesn't question whether it's worthy. It just is what it is, completely, fully, without reservation. In that sense, the ant is enlightened. Not in the sense of being self-aware about its enlightenment, but in the sense of being completely what it is without resistance, without division, without the suffering that comes from believing you're separate from your source. You, in a human form with self-reflective awareness, have a different capacity. You can know that you're consciousness. You can recognize your essential nature. You can live consciously as what you are. The ant can do that, but the ant also can't suffer from the illusion of separation in the way humans do. Different forms, different capacities, same consciousness, same essence, same divine presence being both. When you see that, you can't not honor all forms. You can't not recognize the sacred in everything. You can't not worship, in the sense of recognition, the ant as much as the Messiah, because you see they're identical, not in form, in essence, in substance, in what they are beneath all appearances. This is the proof I promised you, not external proof, not scientific proof, not philosophical proof, direct experiential proof that you can verify right now. Look at your hand. Move your fingers. What's doing that? You might say, I am. But who's the I? Can you find it? Where is the entity that's moving the hand? There's intention to move. There's movement happening. There's awareness of both. But can you locate a separate self that's doing it? Or is there just consciousness being intention, being movement, being awareness, being the whole experience? Look carefully. The more carefully you look, the less you find a separate doer. What you find is just happening, just consciousness in motion, just experience arising. If there's no separate you doing this, then who's moving the ant? That singular presence, identical intelligence, same source. Not the ant as a separate entity, not you as a separate entity, just consciousness being both, moving both, expressing as both. That's verifiable, that's checkable. That's not something to believe. Right now, in your experience, when you see it, when there's a direct moment of recognizing that there's only consciousness here, being everything, that's the shift. That's the recognition. That's what dissolves the hierarchy and exposes the truth that was always present but not always seen. You don't maintain that recognition constantly. It comes and goes. Thoughts arise that recreate separation. The habit of being a separate self reasserts. That's normal. That's the human pattern. But each time you recognize truly, each time there's a moment of seeing that only consciousness exists, that recognition deepens. The truth becomes more obvious. The illusion becomes more transparent. You start to live differently because you're seeing what's true and responding to that truth. You start to treat things with more care because you recognize consciousness in all forms. You start to move through the world with more reverence because you see the sacred everywhere. You start to drop the hierarchies because you recognize their falseness. This includes dropping spiritual hierarchies, the recognition that your consciousness doesn't make you special, because everything is consciousness. The recognition that you're divine doesn't elevate you above others, because everything is divine. The recognition that you're that doesn't create separation between you and anything else, because everything is that. You can honor the Messiah and honor the ant. You can bow to the Guru and bow to the tree. You can revere the sacred text and revere the living earth, the deepest level of devotion. Recognition of the truth all traditions point to when you get past their surface differences. This is what the mystics throughout history saw. This is available to you right now, not as a future achievement, but as present recognition. The ant is the Messiah. The Messiah is the ant. Both are that. Only that exists. And you are that, recognizing itself through this form, in this moment, experiencing these words that are also that. The question is whether you're willing to see it, whether you're willing to drop the comfortable hierarchies and recognize what's present, whether you're willing to let the ant be your teacher, showing you that consciousness appears in all forms without judgment about which forms are worthy. If you are willing, if you're ready to see this clearly, then every moment becomes an opportunity. Every encounter becomes a meeting with the divine. Every form becomes a doorway to recognition. The ant crawling across your path is an invitation. Will you see it as a separate thing beneath your notice? Or will you recognize it as consciousness in form, worthy of identical recognition you'd give any expression of the divine? That choice, or truly, that recognition, is available in every moment with every form you encounter. The more you recognize truly, the more you see what's always been true. And all things are that, only that, forever that. Being everything, including you, experiencing this, recognizing yourself. Before we close, I want you to do something. Find an ant. If you can't find any small creature or even just visualize one, look at it. Not with the usual glance that dismisses small things, but truly look, observe it, watch it move. Notice the intelligence in its movement, the purpose in its actions, the life force animating that tiny form. Then ask yourself what's looking, what's aware of this ant, and what is the ant made of? Where does the awareness of the ant end and the ant begin? That seeing, that direct recognition, that's the proof. Not proof to convince someone else, proof for yourself. Verification in your own direct experience that consciousness is all that exists, that the ant is that the Messiah is that you are that. When you see it, you can't not worship, not in the sense of performing rituals, in the sense of recognition, acknowledgement, seeing truly. The ant becomes sacred because you see what it is. The Messiah becomes divine because you recognize what all forms are. Worship accordingly, which means recognize truly, see clearly, meet everything as what it is. The divine appearing as form, the infinite expressing as finite, the one being many while remaining one. The ant knows this without knowing it. The Messiah knew this by knowing it. You can know this by recognizing it right now, in this moment, as what you are and what everything is. That's the teaching. That's the proof. That's the truth. The ant is waiting to show you God. Will you see it?